Happy to have you all here, and we're really happy to have Eelco Harteveld as well. He is an associate professor here at the UvA in political science, where he studies and teaches political behavior with a focus on populism and polarization. He's a leading scholar in the field of effective polarization and researches its causes and consequences in European democracies. And today he'll be talking about political stereotypes and how to measure them. So Eelco, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you all for having me here today. Welcome viewers at home who are seeing me at a very awkward angle, I think. But in the YouTube video, there will be a beautiful new widescreen image of me. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Anyway, so thank you. Welcome for bearing with me talking about political stereotypes, which is basically a topic that I became interested in, started to work on, plan to work on in the coming years. So I think in terms of the title of the talk, I might have sort of ended up with overpromising, under-delivering, because it sounds like I'm going to tell you everything there is to know about political stereotypes, which isn't the case, because I think as a field, this is really quite still in its infancy. Of course, we know a lot about stereotypes as such, but political stereotypes, especially outside of the US context, that's really still, I think, a lot of work in progress. So rather, I want to give you sort of some general ideas, sort of framework to how to think about this, some ways that this research could develop in the future. Hopefully also maybe as an inspiration for you maybe to connect to that field and literature. When it comes to the question on how to measure them, there I will not give a full overview either, but rather want to sort of point out, give two small teasers of two studies that I'm currently conducting to sort of measure these in a bit more innovative way. So that's my plan for today. So first I want to tell you about a new hobby that I have developed recently, which is that I like to talk to ChatGPT all day, which I'm not proud of it. And one of the questions I like to ask it, because I'm interested in stereotypes, is to sort of give me a visualization of political groups. So it does that through DALL-E, of course. Right? So I might ask it to depict for me the typical, say, green voters of the Green Left Party, say, in the Netherlands. So if we think about voters of the Green Left, what sort of attributes do you think we should get into that picture? What sort of stereotypes do you have of the green voter? Yeah, how would you translate that? Thoughts? Okay. I hope an LLM is able to sort of capture that very specific cultural reference. Yeah, so a particular way of dressing. Other stereotypes. Earth color outfits, okay. Oh, quite some specific stuff. Anything else?
Youngish.
Youngish.
Plant-based diets.
So let's see what DALL-E came up with. This thing is responding to me. Oh, no, this one. This is the Green Left, according to ChatGPT, visualized through DALL-E. I think it rings some bell with stereotypes of urbanites, way of dressing, way of sitting in a cafe, etc.
But it's old and young people, right?
It's old and young people.
Yeah, and it's pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, what is the actual stereotype and what's sort of the front stage intervention by ChatGPT to make it less stereotypical, right? We don't know what's the thing there. So what might be this group of people? What party families ChatGPT visualizing here?
50 plus.
50 plus?
Party family. No, party family.
Party family, not yet.
Christian.
Yes,
Yeah.
Philip gets the award. Yeah, Christian Democrats. With some random university student.
University, actually. It says university.
University. And this is the VVD, the Liberal Conservative Party. So I thought, okay, good news. I can sort of retire. ChatGPT can answer my research questions for me. Until I asked it to give me a visualization of the PVV voter. The same prompt as I did elsewhere. And then it said, nah. Wait, is it? It's responding very.
No response.
It said, nah, well, actually, it's challenging to just depict one political group that's a bit stereotypical. It's better to sort of be inclusive and respectful and not depict a political group based on the. So I said, well, that's what you've just been doing for the Christian Union, but okay. So apparently I still need to do some work myself here because GPT is not going to solve all my research. So I would like to talk to you today about what political stereotypes are, why I think we should care about them, maybe more precisely why I care about them, which is because I think they're closely related to polarization, which is a topic I'm also interested in, as you mentioned. I'd like to say a couple of things about what happens if we study this phenomenon in a multi-party setting, which always makes everything more complicated. And then a brief suggestion of 2 studies I'm currently working on operationalizing them. So I think this one is not working so well. Maybe I'll just click here. So political stereotypes, what are they? Well, what are stereotypes in general? I've just brought one definition. There's some that go around. This one is quite popular within political science. Stereotypes are beliefs about the characteristics, attributes, and behaviors of members of certain groups. You get the gist of it. I think another relevant way to think about it is that stereotypes are sort of intuitive generalizations. So they are intuitive because we're not always aware that we are having them, but we do apply them. So in addition, I think it's important to know that stereotypes do not have to be negative to be a stereotype, right? It can be positive. We might have obviously very positive stereotypes about our own social groups we belong to, right? Left-wingers might think that they, I don't know, have a great taste in food or whatever, great ways to hang out in the bar. They also don't have to be completely wrong. And by that I mean that they might have some sort of correspondence with a real correlation in society. Right? So progressives do live in cities more often than conservatives do, right? That's a correlation that exists. Doesn't mean that everybody in the city is a progressive or all progressives live in the city. That's a sort of wrong way of using heuristic, that's representativeness heuristic, that's at the basis of a stereotype. They might reflect a correlation, but also they might not, right? They might also just be some sort of stereotype that has been told to us by political elites or that we see in the media, some famous exemplars that we turn into a stereotype. So they don't have to respond to any particular correlation in society. And they're also omnipresent in the sense that it seems we very easily stereotype all sorts of groups in society. Soon as we sort of in an intergroup setting, we very easily sort of construct these ideas about what these groups are like. And the fact that stereotypes are impactful, I think, is quite evident if you think, for instance, about gender stereotypes and how they might impact hiring decisions, right? So I would say that political stereotypes are generally the stereotypes that are about politically defined groups. But just to get some sort of flavor of what that might be about, this is a study by Douglas Aller and Gaurav Sood from 5 years ago, or 2018 already, where they asked Americans to sort of tell what share of the main political camps were composed of which particular groups. So say, what would you say is the percentage of the Democrats that is, say, an atheist? What's a percentage that comes to mind? Exactly. Yeah, I think indeed you would be too skilled in this sort of reasoning. But go about this. Just give me a number.
60% of this stereotype.
60%. It would be off the scale already. Yeah. So the actual number is 8%, which might be lower actually than all these very skilled thinkers in the room would have thought. And that's a true percentage, and the stereotype or the perception in the public of 30%. What percentage of the Republicans might be over 65?
30?
30%? And that was, indeed, it's not so far off. It's actually 20%, but in the eyes of the Democrats, it's 40%. Now, of course, we know we're not very good at reasoning with percentages and base rates and stuff. So maybe this is sort of a mean way to call people out, but it gives an idea of that we also can sort of reason about these categories. So what are political stereotypes about? What could be sort of the content of these stereotypes? We've seen a couple of things, age, religion. Here's a famous quote by this pleasant guy who's the leader of the Club for Growth, a conservative action group in the United States, famously described left-wingers as tax hiking, government expanding, latte drinking, sushi eating, full driving, New York Times reading, etc. You get the gist. I think these are quite stereotypical stereotypes in a way. This is the way we talk about it. The way you think that people think about political groups, meta stereotypes or something. Oh, I'm inventing a new research line here. You can see this is about all sorts of things, about way of behaving, about ideology and stuff. So I think we can say that stereotypes are obviously very context dependent, right? They're very different across societies, but I think we can maybe summarize them in some sort of domains of stereotypes. So I've come up with a list of 4, some of which are also quite prominent in the literature. I'm not sure what the best terms are, whether this list is sort of exhaustive, but here we are. So first of all, stereotypes can be about ideology. Like Snyderman put it, what we think that other people think, or what we believe that other people believe, right? And of course, you might say in a democracy, it's actually important that we have ideas of what different political groups stand for politically, right? That's how we organize our democracy around substantive conflict. But research also shows that actually we're quite bad at estimating this, right? That we tend to see our political opponents as more extreme than they are, because we take the most extreme among of a political group as sort of an exemplar of the whole. Another type of stereotype is about the social sort of group that makes up a political group, right? Think about the urban residents of progressives. They might also be more higher educated, that sort of things. These social groups. Yet another sort of domain of stereotypes is about the traits that they have, the sort of person that they are, right? Are they intelligent or stupid or self-interested or whatever? These are quite dominant also in the US literature. I think a 4th one would be interesting to add, which is stereotypes about lifestyle. If you think about the list we just saw, right, the latte drinking, full driving stuff isn't maybe so well captured by these others, but I think they might be quite pervasive. More and more domains of our life are sort of becoming political, so we might be sort of having more and more lifestyle stereotypes. I think these are some relevant domains. And there's a book called Partisan Next Door. I also quote it later on by Busby et al. And they make an important point that the sort of stereotype matters. So if we think about political opponents in terms of their ideas and their ideology, we still keep that in the domain of politics in a way, right? We're still within the realm of disagreements. We might be wrong about how much we disagree, but still it's within that domain. If we think about political groups as by their social attributes, we're sort of seeing political groups as a composition of other groups that we also might have opinions about. If we start to see political groups as having very clear traits and ways of life, we start to see them really as a social group on their own, with the full spectrum of very essentialized characteristics. So the sort of, I would say, sort of domain of stereotype might matter for how they impact our relation with that group. Just to return to the lifestyle example, this is a thing I always do with students, so you also have to try it out. There was a quiz back in 2020 in the New York Times which asks, can you tell the Trump fridge from the Biden fridge? And how it worked, they collected photos of fridges, like hundreds of thousands of people sent their fridge photo to the New York Times. And then readers had to guess what the partisan identity was of the respective fridge owner. Any of you done this before? Okay, let's do one here. So here's a fridge. I'm not sure you can see it all the way in the back. This is a fridge of a real person with a real partisan identity. Was this a Trump or a Biden voter?
Biden.
Biden? Wait, how do you know?
There's a vegan butter up there.
I must admit I hadn't spotted that one yet. Which one is the vegan butter?
It's there's three. The one to the right, the yellow one.
Well,
First balance. Yeah.
well, there you go. That's indeed the correct answer. Well put. So another fridge.
Trump. I mean, you would think, but
Anybody else? Any counter clues? Trump fridge? Actually, also a Biden fridge. Yeah.
stereotyping.
Stereotyping. Actually, what I find most appealing, most interesting about this whole thing is that they report on the way down on the website the percentage of correct guesses, which is 52%.
That's what we exactly did now.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what you did. Yeah. So you're so representative of the American public, which goes to show that we think, oh, that fridge is going to tell us a lot about the political group. What they eat will be so informative, but actually it's not so informative as we think. So we are sort of caught out here for having stereotypes too. There's really not so much work on this outside of the United States, as I mentioned. There's great work by Delia Solinger in Zurich, which is relevant in this regard, where she basically asked far-right and green voters to describe each other and themselves, basically in any word that comes to mind. So this resulted in a list of words that were more likely to occur among neo-left voters or far-right voters. Left-wingers were like left-wing, socially minded, interested. Any social groups in here?
Students.
Students, yeah, students in there. Far-righters are sort of rural, I think. It also mentioned that, yeah. So it's a bit also indeed, I think most of those domains also occur here. So why should we care about political stereotypes? As I said, the reason that I care about them is that they are closely tied, I think, to polarization in our society, and in particular to affective polarization, or basically sort of the degree to which politics is creating antagonism in our society between different political camps. And I think they are related in a sort of most obvious way, because we can both think about them as instances of intergroup conflict and categorization, where the stereotypes are perhaps more sort of the cognitive part of it and the affective polarization more of the affective component of it. So if we think a lot about polarization as intergroup conflicts, we can think about political identities as rooted in social identities, right? The ways of describing yourself in relation to others, us versus them, thinking like your average football team identity. And like any social identity, the relation between the groups involved can sort of how warm or cold that is, how antagonistic that is, can be quite detached from the actual sort of differences or disagreements between them, right? As any football fan knows, regardless of what the other team does, they will always be sort of have played a bad match or something, right? There's a clear instance where our perceptions and our cognition follow from our identities and our affect. And the same is true, I think, for stereotypes and polarization. So I would link them in sort of that framework. We can therefore think of stereotypes as a further driver of affective polarization, but also something that follows or is further increased by affective polarization. So I think the mechanisms for the former, stereotypes as a driver of affective polarization, I think there's at least two. First, there's the sort of content and spillover of the content of the stereotype. So say you associate a political group with all sorts of other groups, then your dislike towards that group will spill over. So if you dislike people in the city, obviously horrible people, then you associate that with the left, then left-wingers also become more dislikable. So there's a sort of spillover from one domain to the other. Also, stereotypes make a political group look more recognizable and homogeneous than they actually are homogeneous. Right? Stereotyping a group makes them look more homogeneous and therefore more threatening in a way, which further spurs this outgroup derogation. They're all the same, makes it harder to identify with them. Stereotypes can also be the result of the existence of polarization. So here we can argue that I think polarization leads to further need to differentiate. So if you have a really sort of strong effective polarization towards a political group, you also have a emotional stake almost that group is really different from you, right? You need that to be the case. And therefore you're going to project all sorts of things on them to make them different from you. So they become more and more stereotypical. And also, of course, you will engage in motivated reasoning. So any information that counters the stereotype will be harder to pick up on or process. So it's a two-way street. I don't think we can say one is to blame for the other, but rather I think they can encounter a spiral of sorts. So I would be interested to study that mutual relation. I think the important takeaway then is that political divides are always about much more than just these political labels. But there's much under the surface going on when we would ask people what they think of a particular political group. They will also think of other things, and that seeps into that. And I think the literature on polarization is sort of missing out on that often. Is staying very much in the political realm, political labels. So that's why I moved into this, to know what is in people's minds when they think of these political groups. What else is playing a role? And I think we should not ban polarization outright. I think we need some level of conflict in democracy, obviously. But we want that to be about something that exists in reality in a way. So if we are imagining divides to be greater than they are, then polarization is purely self-reinforcing. And I think that's a normative worry that I have about the relation between stereotypes and polarization. So some stereotypes might be more polarizing than others. That follows from what I said before, that I think if your stereotypes lead to more social classification more broadly, so if you see the stereotypes make a political group very essentializing in their own way, that should be more associated with more polarization. So if we have not ideological, but really the social and the trait and lifestyle stereotypes, I think those should be associated more with polarization outcomes. Okay, I'd like to mention two more things. These are a bit more brief. First of all, what happens when we move this study to a multi-party context? And then how could we operationalize these stereotypes? What am I working on in that regard? So in a multi-party context, there are some complicating factors that also lead to some implications for how we understand stereotypes, I think. So why are things more complicated in multi-party systems? First of all, there's the fragmentation, the presence of many more political labels than in the US, where all the previous studies were done. Right? So if there's, say, 18 parties in Dutch Parliament, or what's the number nowadays? I haven't kept track. We're not having full-fledged stereotypes on all these domains about all these labels, probably, right? Or maybe political junkies do, but not everybody else. There's also, to a more relevant degree, different levels of political identification. We might identify ourselves with a particular issue, but also with a party or not at all, or with a particular party family, or political identity might be around an ideology more broadly, the left or the right. So we relate to these different labels to different degrees, and we can have stereotypes about all of them. And there's different patterns of competition and collaboration. And so if you're, I don't know, your favorite mainstream right voter, and your favorite outgroup is the PVV, far right, then you might find that suddenly they're in a coalition the next day, like is happening today. Right? How is that impacting? That in-group outgroup distinction is not so clear and eternal as in the United States. So I think that matters because then stereotypes become more asymmetrical. So I know if the Democrats are highly educated in stereotype and also in reality, and Republicans are probably lower educated. Right? Not necessarily, but there's usually some sort of symmetry between those stereotypes. But if you know that the Greens are higher educated, it doesn't really tell you anything about the Christian Democrats, right? That doesn't necessarily, that might also not even be a sort of relevant domain for Christian Democrats. You might actually think about different domains like lifestyle or something, or having these, I don't know, the old-fashioned paintings on the wall, which you saw in the GPT visualization. So they're asymmetrical and they're also sort of multi-level. We have stereotypes about left-wingers and right-wingers. Most people might have those. And the more politically interested you are, you might also have more and more stereotypes about the individual partisan groups. So not everybody has the same stereotype. It is very complicated, and at the same time, I'm going to sweep that under the rug for now, and think about, well, if we want to study this, which I hope to be able to do, then we first need to operationalize this. That's the how to measure them part. So I'll end with a couple of words about that. So how did this book, which I just mentioned, the most recent comprehensive, well, it's not really a long book, but output on this, how did they go about studying political stereotypes? They used open-ended answers, questions in a survey. They asked to the respondents to give them words that typically describe people who support either the Democratic or Republican Party, and to tell them in general. And then there was another question to give the traits that they associate to tell about the groups that the respondent associates and about the issues. So it's very deductive in the sense that these categories were hardwired into the data collection. But of course, you can still see what pops up in the general category. And then they use structural topic modeling to see how these stereotypes go together. So for instance, one thing that they find, which I think relevant, is that there's different over these topics, right? Topic modeling gives you these topics, and there's just different groups of people basically who talk about there's one group of people who talks about their political opponents mostly in terms of the issues and the groups they associate them with, right? So about being poor or left-wing or liberal or that sort of stuff, or Christian, older, conservative. That's one group of people. There's others who really like to talk about their opponents in these traits way. It's stubborn, intelligent, dumb, rich. I think rich might be more of a social one, but anyway. And they find that this latter group of people is much more negative about the political opponents. So these do not impact effective polarization, these ideological and social stereotypes, but the trait stereotypes are associated with a lot more polarization. So I think that makes sense. So two studies I'm doing of my own currently. First is also using open answers. And secondly, I want to, that's still very speculative, use word embeddings to look at the relation between words relating to politics and other words. So first of all, I am doing a study using, like Busby et al., open answers and surveys, which is sort of a indirect result of a different project I worked on. And there we asked 11,000 respondents in 9 countries to reflect in their own words on either the similarities or the differences between them and their sort of favorite political enemy group. But depending on the survey experimental category they were in, they had to do either those two things. And we did this purely to sort of polarize or depolarize these people. So we were not interested actually in what they were writing down. It was just sort of a cue for them to become sort of heated up about politics or to cool down. But now that we have this data, I thought, well, we might as well look at it. But with so many answers, it would be very expensive to sort of do it all my own or with research assistants. So I tried out a LLM-assisted coding of the presence of these 4 categories of stereotypes. See if a large language model could help me code that in the 11,000 cases. So I used the LLM, which you might have heard of, ChatGPT, through the API. Basically, I ask it define those domains of stereotypes, right? Ideology, social groups, etc. Then ask it which of those are present in a particular answer, and to give me an explanation as well. I followed Peter Turnberg's some great articles about how to go about this. So I coded a share of these myself, then tried out the prompt, see if that was sort of 80% correct. Well, if I'm perfect, the first time around. And then I refined the prompt, right? I looked at the explanations GPT gave for giving their answer. Based on that, I refined the prompt, etc. And I arrived by now at 92% accuracy. I think I need to go get even better, but just to give you a glimpse of what the data looks like with this particular prompt so far. This is the data from the UK. Basically, for all the political outgroups, I have the distribution of the sort of stereotype that is applied when talking about them. And there you can see that really ideological words are used most often to talk about political outgroups. Maybe that's a good thing. Well, if you read the open answers, it's not really kind usually, but at least it's in the realm of ideas, political differences. There's also quite some trait stereotypes going around. Very few lifestyle stereotypes. And I was really sad about that because I invented this category and now nobody uses it. So probably because GPT can't code that correctly. There's actually also some social stereotypes, but they are much more common for right-wingers than left-wingers. And I also find that in the different cases. I think that it's easy to call out conservatives for being rich or something. But denigrating left-wingers for being working class or something is not so sort of socially desirable to do as an insult, right? So we might be reporting on some stereotypes and not others. And I think partly that's also what's being picked up over here. So look at the US data. There's again a lot of ideological stereotypes and mostly traits for the Republican Party rather than for the Democratic Party. And just again, this is very preliminary data, but if I look at the correlation between those and effective polarization, so the extent to which they dislike the other group, these are the coefficients. So the presence of each of those categories is associated with more effective polarization. And the traits category mostly so, like in Busby's work. Ideological stereotypes are not necessarily less so. But just to give you an idea of that's where I'm going with this project. Then the second thing I just started to work on or explore is stereotypes and word embeddings to get at those stereotypes in a more sort of covert way. Because asking people leads to very socially desirable answers. But I think more generally, we can think about stereotypes really as also a social and a cultural phenomenon almost, right? It's an individual that holds that stereotype, but also we're constructing that in all of our cultural output in a way, right? It's everywhere. So we can think that also as being close to, say, the bias that large language models might have, right? The things they associate with left-wingers and right-wingers that apparently you need to get out if you're a commercial LLM, or close to representation in word embeddings. There's this cool study, was a tip by Peter Turnberg actually, where this was applied to class categories. Where they could look at decades of text information about what words were associated at this higher abstraction level with class categories and how that developed since the 1900s. So I think it would be really cool to do something like that for political terms. What associations have developed over time with terms like left and right party labels. So that's just a teaser. Okay, so whenever you're in any stereotypical company around next time, Please do some field work for me. Also, this is just a project I'm working and developing now, so I'm also really interested to hear your thoughts or insight, or to keep that conversation going in the next couple of years. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you for the presentation.
Sure. Welcome.
Yeah, Delaney.
Just in terms of the trait that you feel like you didn't find enough in that, it very well could just be how it was prompted. So what exactly?
Stay here, or for the video? Should I stay here for the video?
You can also just move your camera if you want, whatever you prefer. What exactly was the prompt that you asked them?
Yeah, so by now the prompt is this long, because that's what happened during the refinement. For instance, it's GPT. If somebody was called racist, GPT coded that as a trait all the time. Where you could think of that in a more broader sense as a trait associated with somebody, but I would like that to be in the ideological category. So I really had to say explicitly, do not include traits that could also be understood in a different way as a trait, but that's actually more ideological.
But I also mean like with how you asked the participants.
Oh,
like
sure,
what
yeah.
you said to them.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think maybe if it was, they might have just interpreted it as staying political, so not
Yeah.
going into all that social kind of stuff.
Yeah, you're right. Sure, yeah. We do ask them about any difference that comes to mind between you and, say, Green voters.
Yeah.
But of course, they're in the context of a study about politics, so that is the context. So I might very well underestimate that. That's why I also think this is not perfect data to study stereotypes. We didn't intend it to be as such. That's why I'm sort of trying to get a cheap way to still analyze it, but to get to those real distributions, I think this is not the perfect data.
Right.
Maybe to some of the correlations with other outcomes, yes, but not that distribution.
Really interesting work, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. This is super interesting. I was wondering how the amount of stereotypes people hold in multi-party systems, for example, a large multi-party system like the Netherlands, corresponds to political interest and political knowledge. So who holds the most stereotypes? Because in order to have those stereotypes, you need to be aware of all 18 parties and you need to know enough about them in order to form stereotypes. Yeah. But then again, relying on stereotypes is a simpler heuristic. So is it maybe those who are lowest in knowledge? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think we can think about that either way, indeed. I mean, there's, for sure, I think that people at different levels of political sophistication or interest will maybe have stereotypes for more levels and a broader category of groups. So having stereotypes about the main 5 parties might be quite common, but for the more niche parties, if you're not really voting for them yourself or in some more antagonistic relation with them, that might be more rare. So maybe it's about the number. What I think is interesting is that exactly as you mentioned, that if we become more political interest, we might also become aware that these are stereotypes and maybe not, or we read into that more and we're more aware of actually the nuances. So in a way, we might still have that stereotype, but it's not as large in our minds, or it doesn't have the same level of entitativity in our minds. We don't see the group as homogeneous. So I think that's actually also something we want to measure or understand, like how strongly held is that stereotype? Do people see that as just merely an association, or are they really convinced that everybody is like that? I think these percentage questions are a bit lame in some way, but they might be able to get there. So yeah, I think that can go both ways. I hope to be able to give that answer. So, yeah.
First, also feel free to type questions into the chat. I'm monitoring it. Then Honorata and WhatsApp.
Thanks, Eelco. Fascinating new project that you are developing here. And I was wondering here about the causal path that you're proposing and what's the theoretical underpinnings you have there. Because on one hand, I see your point that when you have stereotypes, you become more polarized, right? So that's the story that you are presenting. But then your data also, in a way, shows that those who are the most polarized actually attribute these extra traits to, the essentializing traits to the other groups. So how would you, well, what are your ideas about teasing this out?
Yeah, so I think we need other types of data, experimental data. This was an experiment, but this was part of the polarizing stimulus. So there's no post hoc measure of this. Otherwise, I would maybe be able to sort of find some of that. So I think it would require polarizing people and then seeing whether they have more stereotypes. Reversely, that's something that Eelco Harteveld also did, disconfirming stereotypes with them, and then seeing if that impacts their view of political conflict. So I didn't plan any experiments, but I think that would be, now that you put it like that, I think that should be really a part of it as well, if I claim to be interested in those both of these causal reactions, right? Or do you see another other?
So I was just wondering whether there are two different theories that would predict, the opposite way of interaction between these factors, because you present it in one way, but maybe there is also just theoretical reason to believe that it's the other way around, right?
Yeah. But I think
you have some levels of attributing traits to different groups, and then maybe at the level where you are a very strong political identifier, you also attribute this extra layer of traits to the people, right? And not the other way around.
That's that's a great point.
Thank you for the talk. This touched a little bit upon what you said about how strongly held they are, but I was also wondering if you have an intuition about how constant they are, and if some people might be more inclined to update stereotypes and others maybe more keep to the same stereotype over a longer period of time.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. Would you have an idea what sort of might predict that willingness to update stereotype? Sorry for returning the question.
I can imagine that.
I'm outsourcing my research to others.
I can imagine that stereotypes for some people might be more politically motivated.
Yeah.
Or held as a way to moralize or to justify your own positions, whereas for other stereotypes might come from a less political place.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like a very operational, flexible idea, but.
No, I think that makes sense, and that also locates that within that broad sort of spiral that I located, where we might sort of within our socialization not be so have strong political identities or be so antagonistic about politics, and we just learn about stereotypes from these various sources, from the media, from books, from political discourse, from meeting people. So we develop these stereotypes, and they're updated quite efficiently, maybe with these new impressions. And at some point, we sort of entrench our political identities, and we need to be different from the Greens or something. So then we live in the countryside, so the Greens need to live in the city, and then there's real stake in a way at keeping those stereotypes as they are, or getting them confirmed. So then that motivated reasoning mechanism becomes more and more, and differentiation mechanism more important. So indeed, I think that the level of updating depends on the strength of that political identity. Indeed, yeah, something like that. Yeah, great point.
Thanks, Eelco. Really good location of those things, and very curious for the meetings when you're going to find there to like bypass the moderation of activity and so on. Firstly, I thought because you talked a bit about homogeneity and negativity, I thought shouldn't we talk about distinctiveness in multi-party settings, right? So whether or not whether the output is homogeneous is one thing, but if it's not that we think that all conservatives are rich, but all the rich are conservative or something. And the other thought, what I really liked when you were talking a bit about how in multi-party systems we might have certain different levels, you said, so like left-right, but also different combination of stereotypes. And I thought what I thought about the Austrian Neos, the libertarian party, and I have certain trait stereotypes, but there's somehow not weaponized in a way. Like I don't think, like if we think about hierarchy, because we propose a bit of a hierarchy of stereotypes in terms of how impactful they might be for effective distance. And I'm wondering whether maybe certain combinations are, but certain combinations are not. And that's something we might actually already be able to explore. So like whether if I just have this like social caricature of a certain support group, that might actually not be that problematic. But if I combine that with a very clear also ideological stereotyping, it might actually be much more sort of potent or something.
Yeah,
that could be maybe a cool idea.
Yeah.
And I'll definitely sign up to whatever newsletter of like future.
Great newsletter. Yeah, thanks, Phil. Yeah, if only somebody would write a master thesis about the difference between distinctiveness. I mean, your point more broadly, I think the first point also touches upon the question of, does it matter what the sort of the real composition of a group is? Because all Christian Union voters are Christians. Well, maybe not, but they really are in a way. There's sort of a truth to even a very strong stereotype about this particular group being Christians, right? So, whereas for some of the other groups, that's much less clearly the case. So there might be, and there that distinction you mentioned comes into play. It might be very easy to recognize a Christian Union voter by being Christian. Not all Christians are Christian Union voters, but the other way around is true. And that might make for very strong stereotypes, because it's correct, basically. So I haven't touched upon that here, because I'm interested in this idea of also then saying whether a stereotype is accurate or not. But I'm not sure if we can say it because there's not like a real percentage attached in our minds or something to it's just a association that we have. And we can't say whether it's true or wrong unless we express it as a percentage or so, right? Then we can compare it with a real percentage. But there's no sort of referent in people's minds to compare that with. So, but still to predict which groups end up being stereotyped and by what stereotype, I think their distinctiveness might be the most important. Okay, like the Christian Union voters. Then I think you had a very good idea about that. Maybe it's not the type of stereotype per se, but also maybe just a number of stereotypes or a combination of stereotypes. I hadn't thought about it that way. That just having multiple stereotypes also makes the group more and more homogeneous in a way, more essentialized. So that just being social makes you a funny group like the Neos or something, but then if that also has a ideological component that you disagree with, then suddenly that becomes threatening. So yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. That's a great point. Thanks.
Thank you for this presentation. I was wondering if there's a difference between adolescents and older people in terms of political stereotype content, frequency, and stability, especially thinking about political news exposure, such as social media versus listening to the radio or just the TV or newspaper.
Yeah. Oh, that's a fascinating question. Because indeed, I mentioned socialization before, right? I think we have different life phases where we already learn about politics, but we don't care about it so much, right? Which might be as adolescents. I'm not sure, but we are at least usually not so committed to any political camp, right? But we are probably already learning about these associations. That might be a life phase where we're more open to learning about it. But I wonder, indeed, what are the sources that adolescents use then to learn about politics, right? I mean, is that radio and TV or is that on TikTok, right? What sort of stereotypes are there, right? As a medium, that's very different. So yeah, I don't have an answer, but now that you mentioned it, it made me really curious. Does the iPad project have room for a stereotype question in their next survey? No, but I would be really interested to talk about it more. Thanks. Yeah.
Very interested in that. And I guess I came here totally expecting to hear you talking about some sort of political implicit association task because, but you're not currently doing that. But when you mentioned, these are not maybe stereotypes that people would like to explicitly mention, like the ones about class on certain types of groups, you might consider doing an implicit association task, because there at least you can, without explicitly asking people for their associations, get some number on the implicit measures. I don't know if that's something that you would like to consider.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's totally true. Actually, the other day I was discussing with Daphne van der Pas about exactly this, the need to get to some sort of implicit measure of this. I was still trying to make up my mind what the best way would be. So I'm also interested in your thoughts, thinking that maybe implicit association test, right, beyond all the other pros and cons that they have, might be hard to feed a lot of terms in there. So we might be able to get at the fact that indeed progressives are associated with the city or something, but to get this full overview of all the terms, I would ideally sort of throw the entire dictionary in there and a bit more inductively see also which happens. So I think, or is it possible to use that method also with, say, 10, 20 terms?
Yeah, well, then you would run 10 to 20 IATs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're short, but it would be a lot of time for one participant. Yeah, you could also just do like word priming and see whether people are faster to respond to words after certain categories than other categories.
Oh, yeah.
And then you can just, run a whole bunch of words.
Yeah.
Yeah, slightly less sensitive than an IT, but at least you can just throw the entire kitchen sink at it. But you could also have this two-pronged approach where you first do the word embeddings LLMs and just see which categories are relevant.
Yeah.
And then test it in your participant population to see whether those specific words indeed lead to these different IAT scores when you compare the different groups, for example.
Yeah.
Then you can sort of funnel your.
Yeah, I think that's how I was thinking intuitively, that first I feel that there's stereotypes about stereotypes, but we know very little about what actually goes on in minds outside of the US.
Yeah.
So these sort of more inductive methods. Yes, campuses. So indeed, I'm sort of now in the phase of thinking of these inductive methods to get to some first understanding, but then I think later to get that in a more deductive study with AAT. I think that would be, that's a great reminder that's.
Yeah, you could also always check project implicit whether they have not already done at least a little bit of.
Okay.
They've run so many IATs by now that probably there are some political IATs in there as well.
Yes. Okay. Oh, sure. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm an interloper to this group, but I'm visiting the university for a couple of weeks, but great to see this work at a great early stage. And I wanted to ask just a comment first, just because you have the image here right in front of us, just methodologically, it might be interesting and to actually consider visuals, right? I know you're doing a lot of this text-based, but I know there are folks working on things, for example, I know, for example, kids. Who do you think of as a conventional politician and what they draw, and then using images as data kind of approaches to think about the group here wouldn't be surprised that some of the studies reveal it's mostly white men, right? That kids imagine as who are politicians, but that has consequences down the line, right? Or what kinds of careers they might envision for themselves. So I think this visual has to be really exciting as well for what you're doing here. I wanted to pick up on what some other folks have mentioned here already about the malleability or the durability of these stereotypes, because I see a lot of what you're doing here is resonating with kind of intuition from civil society or advocacy that would say, well, to change people's attitudes or behaviors on political issues, let's put an exemplar that either fits with that stereotype or oftentimes distances, right, or is quite far from that stereotype. And I just wondered if your results or your intuition, if you have thoughts on the value of that or the potential usefulness of that kind of approach, and as a way to unstick what can be quite sticky preferences or attitudes. Yeah, some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Thanks. So I had never considered or come across even that visual approach, which you mentioned, but that really made me curious. So thanks for that. We definitely will look that up. Then about indeed, can we leverage this maybe in a way to depolarize people by correcting their misperceptions? This is really, I think, also a big theme in the US. I mean, there's like $1 trillion available there for depolarization interventions, and correcting stereotypes in sort of some of the studies seem to be work quite well, or to sort of give information that depicts the outgroup in a different light. And I think that stereotype correction could be one of those mechanisms indeed. I think that might be normatively appealing as well, because I'm always a bit doubtful whether depolarization is a goal in itself. Maybe it is, but also not always. But it might be a goal in itself for citizens to sort of have a correct idea about what politics is about, what participants are there in the political arena, what do they stand for, who are they? So I think that might be worthwhile in itself. So I think normatively it's also a relevant direction to go to. But I think it's also very hard to model that in a way that it doesn't backfire as well, right? So shoving people things in their face that sort of contrast with their politically related worldview might also backfire. So I think that then has to be done in a more careful way, that actually, introduce a real person or something to them that thinks differently from them, but is really shares a social attribute with them, and then make them really care about each other or something like that. Just throwing a fact at people, I think that's not going to work so well, probably. But I think it's relevant normatively to go as a form of intervention.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was super interesting. I was wondering maybe if you would be able to distinguish whether respondent traits matter for the answers that they give. For example, maybe that women give different answers than men, or based on education level, with regards to the stereotype category that they mentioned.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah. Do you have any intuitive hypotheses?
So, but I can imagine maybe that women would mention lifestyle more or stuff like that. And that meant maybe, I don't know, it's just something.
Yeah. For sure, but because different groups think about politics, are socialized to think about different politics in different categories, right? Depending on how interested you are, where you are politically also yourself. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's an interesting thing I at least can look at with that data I'm now generating, once that prompt is accurate enough. And I'm indeed, I would want to sort of be really inductive and descriptive, and I'm probably not going to be able to publish that anywhere, but really, what are these stereotypes? Who holds which stereotypes? I don't have very strong priors about this, but that's a good point, that just looking at the demographic groups already, not just political groups, but demographic groups already might reveal a lot of variation that's insightful. Yeah.
Guys. Yeah, but I'm going to yield it.
Oh, yeah,
You probably have some.
I don't know, but I was just going to say 2 well-known interventions are indeed positive exemplars. So just having people think about positive people that they know from their, I don't know, reviled group. But the other one is taking the other person's perspective. So forcing people to think about how they would live their life in sort of the situation that the person who supports the other group lives their life. And just doing that sort of as a mental exercise really shows that at least effective polarization, effective association with them goes down. Because I guess it's not really about changing the stereotype per se, but the sort of downstream negative effects, or the downstream negative association that is. I would say that is the normative goal.
Yeah.
Because having stereotypes in itself is not necessary.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's an important distinction. Yeah.
Yeah, do we have time? Okay.
Yeah, I have 1 or 2 more questions. It's actually 4 o'clock, so right? Not logical, you have 1 minute.
The best, just very quickly, the active control of stereotypes. So I can list a bunch of stereotypes that I know are stereotypes. And if you ask me to do this in a task and I want to perform well, I'm going to give you every single stereotype that I've ever heard. Does that mean I hold them as well?
Yeah.
And could you relate that to the IAT measures, maybe a measure of how confident are you in these stereotypes, or just do you hold these stereotypes as well? Because I can name them, but maybe I don't hold them.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, exactly. I was exactly thinking, like in survey setting, to have a question like that, like how I'm not sure. I did confident. I might steal that term, like sort of how salient or how central or important or how certain are you about this stereotype, or confident about are you about this? Might be better than indeed asking what percentage of Christian Democrats is Christian. It's about how sure are you about this? Yeah. I think that's important. And then indeed an implicit measure might also show actually quite some variation under the hood there. Yeah.
Yeah, or it would be interesting if I can name a lot, but say that I have a lot of active control about them.
Yeah.
Does that then affect my IAT scores actually? Am I effective in controlling them?
Yeah. Oh, great point. Yeah.
Took it enough time.
No, good. That's a minute over. We have 4 o'clock. Thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.
Great discussion. As this position in the lab. So, yeah, okay.
It's the last
You're
one.
also getting.
I get a card.
So that.
Thank you.
Thanks again.